Welcome back to He Can Fix Anything. Today, I'm going to show you how to change the alternator on your Honda Odyssey and save yourself hundreds of dollars at the same time. Now, before we get started, if you're not sure whether it's the alternator or the battery that's bad on your car, I have a video where you just use a simple multimeter to check that out, and I'll put a link to the video up in the corner of the screen. Here are the tools you're going to need to complete this job. This is a specialty tool that you use to remove the serpentine belt. There are other ways to do it, but this is really the easiest way because it's nice and thin. And you can a lot of times get these as a loaner or a rental at one of the national auto parts stores. A 10mm combination wrench, 1/4 inch ratchet with a 10mm socket and an extension. A 3/8 ratchet with a 12mm shallow socket, a 12mm deep well socket, a 14mm deep socket, a 14mm shallow socket, and then a couple of universal joint sockets. Those are optional. They just are a lot easier if you use these with an extension during part of this job. One is a 12mm, the other is a 13mm. That all depends on the nut that's used to hold your positive wire on the alternator. You're also going to need a long extension if you go this route. Just a pair of pliers are great. Flathead screwdriver, vice grip, needle nose pliers are preferable, and you'll understand why when you watch the video. It's always nice when you drop things down into the engine to have a magnet with an extension on it. Some brake cleaner to clean your hands, clean parts, and a small amount of grease, paper towels, you know why, and coffee is always mandatory. Now the first thing you want to do is to get this cold air intake out of the way, so we're going to need to remove a couple of buttons. There's one here, and then that will just pop out. To remove those, you just take a screwdriver and you get it under the lip of this button, pop it out, and then they come right out. And it's the same way with this one. Just pop it out, slips right out. Sometimes they'll come apart, but they're easy to put back together. Then this cold air intake comes out pretty easily. You just have to lift it up and it slips right out. The next thing you need to do is to remove one battery cable. Now in this case, I'm going to remove both because there is some corrosion on this positive terminal, but you only need to remove the negative battery cable to make this work safe. And to remove them, all you need is a 10mm socket or a 10mm end wrench. You just tuck that out of the way. Now I want to get to this serpentine belt to take it off, but before that I want to get this hose and a few other things out of the way that will help make room for the alternator when it's ready to come out. The first item I want to move is this hose that goes down to the power steering pump and back to the reservoir, and that just uses a small spring clamp to hold it on. And so if I let go of this, it's going to leak all of the power steering fluid out. And so I want to clamp that shut with this vice grip. Now a needle nose vice grip would be better, but this one's going to do the job since I can't find my needle nose vice grip. All right, that should keep leaks to a minimum. Next, I want to get this reservoir out of the way, and it uses two 10mm bolts to hold it in place. Now this is a tight spot that a socket and ratchet won't fit into, so I'm using this end wrench. Now these are pretty tight, so let me just share a little pro tip with you. If you have an open end like that, you can actually take another wrench, put it on here, and use it as an extension leverage to pry this and crack it open. Now would probably be a good time to mention that having a magnet on an extension is a great tool to have when you drop your only 10mm wrench. Now that I have these two out, I'm going to go ahead and maneuver this out of the way and pull this up to where it gives us a little more space. Next, we want to move this coolant reservoir out of the way again. We want to open up this cavity right here to give space for the alternator when it's coming out. It's supposed to have one of those button clips like we used on the cold air intake. This one is missing, so this actually just pops up and slides out. Now as you're pulling this reservoir out, there's a clip that holds this hard line in place. And let me see, I think I can get a shot of it here. Yeah, there it is. And so you just pop that out, and this reservoir actually has a lot of extra line to be able to get it way up out of the way. So now that we have more room, we can go ahead and get this serpentine belt off. Now this is actually a nifty little tool to have. I think it all fits in here, but it's nice and slim, and this is used to take the serpentine belt off. I'll put a 14mm socket on this. I actually bought it as a set, and so it came with this little unit too that you can hook to a 3/8 ratchet. And so this is a great tool. If you don't have one, you can either buy them, not terribly expensive, or if you go to any of the national auto parts chains like AutoZone and O'Reilly's, they usually let you use them for free. They'll have a checkout program. So I have the 14mm socket on there, and so you just put it down on this tensioner pulley right here. Get it slipped on like that, and then you just turn it and it loosens the belt, and you can slip it off nice and easy. Now is the perfect time to go ahead and inspect this. In this area where you have the ribs, you don't want to see any cracks at all, and you can see this one is still in good condition. But if it is cracked, now is the time to replace it. And a lot of times they're just anywhere from 20, 30, 40 bucks. A little expensive, but definitely a lot cheaper than a tow job. I'm not sure if you can see it or not, but there is definitely some of this power steering fluid on that tensioner idler pulley. And it's also going to be on the belt. Yeah, you can see some wet spots here on the belt. So what you want to do is go ahead and get some brake parts brake cleaner, and spray that down to get all the oil residue off, because it just takes a few seconds and that oil is going to get distributed to the whole belt, and you're going to have more of a likelihood of it slipping and causing problems in the future. Now here's the new alternator. I just want to show you what we're looking at doing next. There are 4 steps left before we can start to pull this alternator, the old alternator, out. The first is you want to disconnect this connection here. Second, you want to unplug this connection in the back. Third, remove this bolt. And fourth, remove that bolt. Now it's probably a good time to mention that I will put a link in the description below where you can buy this alternator. And also I'm going to link all of the various tools and equipment that I used to do this job, so you can also buy that. So let's see. So what we're going to do, there's a cover over that connector we need to pop off. I'm going to go ahead and pull this oil dipstick out just to get it out of the way. We don't want to risk breaking it. The setup I have here is a 3/8 ratchet, a long extension, and a 12mm socket that has a universal joint built in. If you don't have something like this, you can use a shorter extension, and either that or you can use a 1/4-inch drive with a shorter extension. You'll just need to get your hand down in there where I'm going to have mine up above. The other thing you might run into is the nut on this alternator is a 12mm, but the nut on the new one is a 13. So take that with a grain of salt. It could be a 12 or a 13. And generally these are not too tight, so we'll see on this one. All right, got that loosened up. This is another place where having a magnet comes in handy. Just pulls it right out. Next, you're going to want to loosen this 10mm bolt right here, and that'll allow this loom to come loose from the alternator. To do that, I'll use this 1/4-inch ratchet with an extension and 10mm socket. Now I'm going to remove this bracket that the loom was mounted to, and that's just going to give me a little more room. And then I'm going to remove the 2 mounting bolts for the alternator. To remove that bracket, I'm going to use this 12mm deep well socket. Now there are 2 12mm bolts. One holds the alternator and the other one is bolted into the engine. Now this is what it looks like when it's out. This is the small bolt that holds the wire loom. This is the bolt that holds the alternator, and this is the bolt that goes into the engine. Now the bottom mounting bolt is a 14mm, so I'm using this deep well socket, which fits pretty perfectly. There we go. And there is the long bottom bolt. I need to move this out a little bit to disconnect the connector on the back, the electrical connector, and then kind of wiggle it out through this space. Okay, I just wanted to pause here real quick and show you the progress. This is why mechanics get paid. It's possible for average people like you and me to do this, but you've got to be committed to the process. And so what I've been able to do is just kind of move this thing and kind of bring the nose forward. There's an AC line right here, this low pressure line. I had to pry a little bit to push it forward and get it out of the way. And I'm just slowly kind of jiggling and moving this thing with the goal of bringing it up out of this hole right here. But I need to get that wire disconnected from the back next, and then it should be ready to come out. Okay, so what we have here, this connector, you can see there's a little tab right here, and that's what locks that in. So if we go down and take a look, I have this where we can see it now. If you take a look at that, there is, I'll try not to block you, but basically there's a little pad right here that you push down on, and when you push down on this, it unlocks the tab and you can slide it out. Okay, it is loose now. When I push down on that little tab right there, it actually clicked. You could hear it, and then it just slid straight out. Didn't have to wiggle it or anything. I'm going to remove one more bolt just because this is so tight in here. I can't get the alternator out because this low pressure AC line is in the way. So I'm going to take this, it looks like a 10mm bolt out, and that should be able to get me to move it just enough to be able to slip the alternator through. All right, we got it out. Yeah, moving that, loosening that bolt, and just be able to push this out of the way gave me just enough room to get it out. Now just to put the new one in reverse order. And when I pulled the alternator out, I had the pulley facing up, and so I want to keep it in the same orientation when I'm putting it back in. Before you drop the new alternator in, it's a good idea to go ahead and take the nut and washer off of that because you have a lot more access now than you will later. When working with this alternator, as you're taking it out and putting it back in, it's one good thing to remember is the bracket fits on either side of this boss right here because your bolt goes through and threads in the back part of the bracket. And so you're going to have to slip it out and slip it back in to that space between the bracket. Now that the alternator is back in the area, you want to go ahead and plug this connector back in. I was able to get the alternator back into place, and I need to get the bolts in and the bracket on next. But as you're doing this, be patient with yourself. It's going to be hard on your lower back and your arms. It's pretty tight working in there, and so just try to get it slipped in. If it's not going, move it out a little bit, try going up, try going down, try different things. Eventually you'll find that sweet spot to where it will go in. All right, just threading the bolt in. One thing to keep in mind is you want to make sure that alternator is sitting in between the front and rear half of the bracket, like I showed you, and then you'll just need to jiggle it around a little bit as you're getting the bolt to go through, get that lined up. You'll know it's lined up when it goes in. Go ahead and try to lift up on the alternator to pull it out of that saddle, and if it won't come out, then you have the bolt through it. Now we need to reinstall this mounting bracket for the top bolt and to hold the wiring harness. I went ahead and cleaned that up with the brake cleaner. It's just a lot easier to work with something that's not all slick and greasy. One point you want to remember when you're reinstalling this is as you tighten up the bolts, just thread them in most of the way, but do not tighten them until all the mounting bolts are in place. Otherwise you could tighten one bolt and then it's not going to be lined up to get the other bolt. And so get everything mounted loosely and then tighten all the bolts at the same time. So the first bolt you want to put in is the one that mounts the bracket to the engine. And as I thread that in, I'll go almost all the way, about right there. And then I'll go ahead and put the longer bolt in, like this one right here, to mount the alternator. So to get this alternator bolt, let's see if I can get it, can't really see it behind there, but to get that alternator bolt lined up, I just had to lift up on the alternator a little bit to line that up, and then just thread that in. And then once this is all threaded together, these three bolts, then you can tighten them up. Everything's aligned correct. And next we'll make these electrical connections here. A very important point that you do not want to forget is when you make those two electrical connections, the one on the back and this one on the top, is that you put this rubber boot back on the back and the top. Those are weatherproofing, and if you don't put them back on, then you risk getting water and corrosion and having problems in the future, possibly burning out your new alternator. Next, we'll reinstall this bolt to hold this harness in place. Now that we're done working in that area, go ahead and put your dipstick back in. You don't want to forget that. Next, we're going to want to put the Serpentine belt back on. Now, the main reason I did not take this out is when you look way back there, that bottom pulley to get that belt back around there. Could be a little bit of a chore. And then you also have your AC pulley down here. It could also be a little bit of a chore to get that back around. So I just lift the belt around those. You want to make sure that all the belts are in the grooves on all the pulleys, and then you just use this tension release bar again to get everything put back into place. If you're wondering about the sequence, the diagram you see on the screen will show you exactly how the belt should go back on. Next, we'll put this overflow reservoir back into place, slip it back into the bracket, and replace the button. And I almost forgot, so I'll remind you, go ahead and remount this so it's not shaking around. We're in the home stretch now as we put this reservoir back into place. Now, as we prepare to reinstall this power steering hose down here onto this line, it's a good idea to go ahead. We cleaned up all of this power steering fluid off the belt, and you don't want to get it all wet again. And so it'd be a good idea just put some towels over that. Slip this clamp back into place. Next, we can reconnect the battery and tighten that up, but there's one more thing we need to do before we cover this up with the air intake. You want to take some grease and put that over this. That will block the oxygen from getting to this connection, and it'll help keep the corrosion to a minimum. And finally, we reinstall this cold air intake and the buttons that will hold it in place. The final check, you just want to verify it's working. So the current state of the battery is about 12.2 volts. So I'm going to start it up and see what the system looks like then. All right, engine's running. And we're looking at 14.5 volts, right where it should be. Congratulations on a job well done. You just saved yourself a bunch of money and you got some new experience at the same time.